We're continuing our discussion on what happens next after Russia's annexation of Crimea. Joining me from Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is Taras Kuzio. He's a research associate at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and it's great to have you back on the broadcast. When we talked to you last, you said Yanukovych will never survive. A few hours later, he was gone. So you're a good one to look into the crystal ball. What's going to happen next with this crisis?
Well, I mean, we have 3 elections coming up. We have the presidential elections end of May. Same day, there's the Kiev city elections, which have been dragged out by the previous regime. And then later in the year, you have pre-term parliamentary elections. So by probably the autumn of this year, the fall of this year, there'll be a new leadership in both parliament and at the presidential and at the Kiev city level. So that will be good because a lot of the older crowd will have gone. I think very few people are going to vote for the communists and for the party regions. The new president elected in May is undoubtedly going to be pro-Western, and there'll be a pro-European majority in the European Parliament, which will back up today's signing by Ukraine of the association agreement. But at the same time, of course, you've got probably a few years of very tough and maybe unpopular measures that the government has to undertake as part of the IMF agreement, which is about to be signed, which means that Ukraine will not go into default. That's what the news was today. And of course, you've got structural reforms, which are part of the package of the association agreement that Ukraine's signed with the EU, which also in the short term are not going to be very popular, but the popularity is going to be the visa-free regime that comes with it and the ability of Ukrainian business to enter the biggest market in the world, because later this year, Ukraine will sign with the European Union the free trade agreement. So it's a mixed picture. I think the military threat to Ukraine on the eastern borders is now pretty low, and there are a variety of reasons of that. Vladimir Putin over-exaggerated in his mind, the support of local Russian speakers for a Russian intervention, and also the Ukrainian military and security forces would fight in East Ukraine, which they didn't do in the Crimea. It's a very different situation because Eastern Ukraine is on the way to Kiev, of course.
You know, it's interesting. You said earlier that I don't think anybody has a strategy regarding Ukraine, and you pointed out the West doesn't have a strategy. What's the strategy of Putin at this stage? You don't think he's going to make further moves? And what's the strategy of the West? I mean, are you disappointed in how they've responded?
Well, the West, it's understandable to some degree why the West doesn't have a strategy, because this is a highly unusual situation. So the West is a bit lost in terms of its response. It's also lost for other reasons. We have, I think it's true to say, a weak U.S. president on foreign policy. This is not a question of whether he's a Democrat or Republican, because we've had 4 U.S. presidents since 1991, and 2 of them have been quite tough on Ukraine, both Presidents Clinton and President Bush, and they're both different parties. And we also have a relatively weak and indecisive European Union. It just takes forever for them to make a decision, and they're always pretty late to the table, like they were in Kiev last month when they helped to negotiate a compromise. Plus, many countries in the EU are either disinterested in Ukraine, for example, countries like Italy, Spain in the south, or there are countries which are more Russophile, like Germany, and there are other countries which have very strong financial links to Russia, Ukraine, with very, I would say, corrupt oligarch and other government money coming from Ukraine, Russia into the city of London, Cyprus and elsewhere. So all of these factors together mean that the response of the West is a bit chaotic. It's taken a while, and it also explains why the US is tougher than the European Union, because the US doesn't really lose much in terms of sanctions. It's, you know, the sanctions will hurt, of course, Russia, but it'll also hurt the city of London, Cyprus, and co. As for strategy on the part of Vladimir Putin, that's also difficult to answer, because I think there is an element of his heart playing over his head, of him being highly emotional about what's going on in Ukraine. He lives in his own kind of very Soviet bubble. he really does believe that behind me there are people who are running around, are all a bunch of Nazis and funded by the CIA. His world view is such that he doesn't really understand what's going on around him, and he's riding on a wave of nationalism, and nationalism is always something more, romantic and from the heart rather than from the head. So is he going to move into East Ukraine? I think that was the case a couple of weeks ago. He was toying with the idea. He wanted to conjure up with the use of intelligence agents and paid provocateurs to kind of do sort of some terrorist attacks, some violent demonstrations. They would then blame that on Ukrainian Nazis from Kiev, and the Russian speakers would call for the Russian army to intervene to protect them. That hasn't happened because Eastern Ukrainians are patriotic Ukrainians, although they could be Russian speakers. So he didn't find that support in East Ukraine, and during the meantime, the Ukrainians were able to mobilize their military and other resources in a very big way.
Let me ask you this. If I could just interrupt for just a second, because we're just about out of time. I've asked the other two guests this question. I want to ask you as well. Are we entering a new Cold War, at least in terms of rhetoric, do you think?
I think not yet, because I think there isn't the ideology for a conflict between both sides. Russia doesn't. It's a kleptocratic, violent regime. There isn't really an ideology behind Putin, except some great power Russian nationalism. It's not like in the good old Soviet, days where you had Soviet communism versus the West. And at the same time as well, Putin wants a fight, but the West is not really interested in a fight. I don't think President Obama or the EU are interested in a fight with Russia. Now, that's the case today. If conflict goes further, if Russia does intervene in East Ukraine and there is actually a war, or if Russia decides to go into other places like, for example, eastern Latvia or northeastern Estonia, where there are big Russian speakers, and that drags into NATO, then we are talking about potentially a Cold War.
Well, Taras,
I don't think there's a stomach for that.
We've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us from Kiev. Certainly appreciate it.